It was a night without stars, February 1943. The French countryside lay buried in silence beneath the weight of German occupation. The wind moved through the trees like a whisper, too afraid to speak. On a narrow road outside Rouen, a lone cyclist pushed against the cold. His breath clouded in the air. In the basket of his bicycle, wrapped beneath sheets of lumber invoices, rested a set of hand-drawn sketches, bridges, roads, and something else. Long, narrow ramps that pointed toward the sky. To the German patrols, he was just another farmer making his rounds. To London, though they didn't yet know it, this man would soon deliver the key to their survival. His name was Michel Hollard, an engineer turned lumber trader, a father and a man with a quiet hatred for tyranny. He carried no weapon, wore no uniform. Yet every mile he rode through the occupied countryside was a strike against Hitler's secret weapon, the V-1 flying bomb that threatened to annihilate Britain. And on that freezing night, his silent war had just begun. By 1943, the Second World War had entered its most uncertain phase. The Allies had landed in North Africa, and the tide of war was beginning to shift. But Europe remained locked under Hitler's iron rule. France was suffocating under the boots of occupation. Every town, every farm, every street was watched by German eyes. The Gestapo's presence was everywhere and nowhere, invisible in daylight, merciless at night. For the ordinary Frenchman, survival meant silence. The wrong word, the wrong glance could end in disappearance. Yet among the fear, small acts of defiance began to grow like roots beneath the frozen soil. Quiet, invisible, and unstoppable. Michel Hollard was one of those roots. Born in 1898, he was not a soldier or spy by trade. Before the war, he had worked as a civil engineer, meticulous, methodical, a man who found comfort in logic. When the Germans marched into Paris in 1940, he watched the humiliation of France with a calm fury that never left him. Like millions, he promised himself that one day he would fight back. But unlike most, he actually did. By 1941, Hollard had reinvented himself as a lumber trader, traveling across the countryside under the guise of inspecting forests for timber contracts. His bicycle became both tool and disguise. To the occupation authorities, he was harmless when a quiet man making a living. But behind that ordinary appearance, he was already observing the enemy's movements, memorizing bridges, and sketching railway lines. It was during one of those journeys, sometime in late 1942, that Hollard noticed something strange. Near the forests of northern France, close to the English Channel, German crews were constructing long, narrow concrete ramps hidden under camouflage nets. They appeared in clusters, often near railway lines, always pointing west. To most villagers, they looked like storage sheds or strange farm buildings. But Hollard, with an engineer's eye, knew they were something else. The precision was too exact, the alignment too deliberate. He didn't yet know what they were called, but he understood one thing. These structures were not defensive. They were offensive. They were aimed at Britain. At the same time, London had begun receiving fragmented intelligence about a new German weapon. Allied pilots returning from bombing runs reported seeing vast construction projects in northern France. Reconnaissance photos showed rail spurs and fuel dumps, but the purpose remained unclear. The British codebreakers at Bletchley Park were puzzled. Something large was being built, but what? Unbeknownst to them, the Germans were preparing their vengeance, the Vergeltungswaffe, or vengeance weapons. The first of these would be the V-1 flying bomb, a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine, capable of delivering an 850-kilogram warhead directly onto London. If deployed in time, it could cripple morale, devastate cities, and delay the Allied invasion of Europe. The Allies had to know where these launch sites were, and fast. But the Germans had hidden them deep within the French countryside, protected by camouflage and secrecy. No aerial photo could confirm what was happening inside. That's when a single farmer on a bicycle began to change the course of the war. Hollard, cautious and calculating, decided to investigate. Using his lumber business as an excuse, he visited the construction zones, speaking politely with German guards and local workers. He memorized details, the slope of the ramps, the direction they faced, the length of their foundations. When he returned home, he redrew everything by hand on tracing paper, labeling distances and coordinates with near mathematical precision. At first, he kept the information hidden. Passing such secrets to the Allies was suicide if done carelessly. But as the weeks passed, the scale of what he'd discovered became undeniable. France was becoming a launch pad for Hitler's vengeance. Somewhere across the Channel, London was waiting, unknowingly, for the storm he now saw forming. He needed to find a way to get this information out. Not through letters, not through rumors, but through certainty, and safely across enemy lines. And so began his search for a route to Switzerland, the one neutral border still open to the outside world. Switzerland, the small, neutral island surrounded by war, became Michel Hollard's impossible goal. If he could reach it, he could reach Britain. But the journey from occupied France to Geneva was a maze of German checkpoints, patrols, and curfews. Every bridge and train station bristled with soldiers. Even a misplaced document could mean arrest or execution. Still, Hollard decided to try. At first, he traveled alone. His bicycle carried no insignia, only mud-stained tires and forged travel permits declaring him a lumber trader on official business. The Germans rarely suspected such men. They were part of the background, ordinary, invisible. But Hollard was anything but ordinary. In the cold winter of 1942, he began making careful test runs toward the Swiss border. Each journey was a rehearsal, studying patrol times, noting the movements of guards, learning which small bridges could be crossed unseen. He was patient, never rushing. His engineer's mind understood that a single mistake could undo everything. His first real crossing took place at night near Vallorbe, a small frontier town. Beneath the frozen moonlight, Hollard pushed his bicycle through a forest path and across the narrow tracks that marked the invisible line between Nazi-occupied France and neutral Switzerland. A few meters of snow separated death from safety. He made it. When he arrived in Geneva, exhausted and mud-covered, he went directly to the British legation. Inside, he requested an urgent meeting with someone who understands maps. The official who met him, cautious and skeptical, listened as Hollard unrolled his papers. Hand-drawn, precise, and full of German annotations copied from memory, they showed the location of a vast network of launch ramps stretching across northern France. The British officer immediately telegraphed London. Within days, Hollard was meeting with representatives of MI6. The Secret Service had been flooded with unverified intelligence from occupied Europe, but none of it had ever been this detailed. Hollard's maps were exact down to the degree of elevation, and when compared to aerial photos, they matched perfectly. For MI6, it was a revelation. For Hollard, it was only the beginning. From that moment on, his mission had a name: the Agir Network. It was a one-man resistance group at first, but soon expanded into one of the most effective intelligence rings in France. His cover as a lumber merchant gave him a natural reason to move between towns, and he recruited local couriers and trusted railway workers to carry coded notes. Every member of his group operated in total secrecy. Most never knew each other's names. Hollard's reports sent through Switzerland to London contained the exact positions of V1 sites, roads, fuel dumps, and supply depots. His diagrams showed which tracks were used to transport materials, how many guards were stationed at each location, and even which villages were being evacuated to make room for new launch ramps. Each journey across the border was a test of will. The Germans had begun to suspect something. There were whispers of a spy network operating out of northern France. Patrols increased, arrests spread, but Hollard's disguise held. He dressed like a man of the soil, coarse jacket, mud on his boots, and a cart filled with logs. The Gestapo saw thousands like him every week. Over the following year, he made over 20 separate crossings into Switzerland, sometimes by bicycle, sometimes on foot, sometimes by train under a false name. Each time he carried new sketches, fresh coordinates, and intelligence that would shape the Allies' understanding of Hitler's secret weapon. By early 1943, the British finally knew what they were up against. Hollard's data confirmed that the sites were launching platforms for pilotless aircraft, the first generation of cruise missiles. The V-1 flying bomb was no myth. It was real, operational, and aimed directly at London. Churchill's inner circle moved quickly. The Royal Air Force was ordered to begin systematic bombing of the launch ramps. The operation was codenamed Crossbow, a direct response to the intelligence that had come piece by piece from a single man's bicycle rides across France. For Hollard, it was a victory measured not in glory but in survival. Every successful crossing meant another chance to return to his family, and another blow to the German war machine. He was becoming one of Britain's most valuable agents. But in the eyes of the Gestapo, his luck could not last forever. And as 1944 approached, the walls around him began to close. Michel Hollard's network did not look like a network at all. It was invisible, stitched together through trust, silence, and improvisation. Each piece was ordinary on the surface: a station clerk, a teacher, a postman, a farmer, a nun. None of them were trained agents. They were simply French men and women who refused to look away. Hollard's strength was his ability to use the ordinary as camouflage. While the Germans built fortresses of concrete and steel, he built his resistance out of human faces. He called it agir, to act. From his base near Paris, Hollard kept meticulous ledgers for his supposed lumber business. On the surface, they recorded shipments of wood and railway deliveries. In truth, the columns and numbers were encoded reports about troop movements, construction materials, and the shape of the mysterious launch ramps. A figure in the timber column might actually mean the number of guards. A rail car shipment could describe ammunition convoys. Each page was a deception, simple enough to pass inspection, complex enough to carry intelligence across a continent. Hollard's couriers learned to carry information not in paper, but in memory. He trained them quietly, showing them how to describe what they'd seen without ever writing it down. The trick, he said, was to remember patterns, not details. A Gestapo interrogator could break a lie, but he couldn't extract what didn't exist on paper. Every week, Hollard gathered their reports, verified them, and began the long journey toward Switzerland again. He'd travel 400 kilometers each way, through checkpoints, forests, and bombed-out towns, just to deliver a handful of sketches and figures to MI6. The British officers in Geneva waited anxiously for his arrivals. They had codenamed him Farmer, a tribute to his disguise and humility. London began to realize how crucial his information was. The RAF's aerial photographs, once full of uncertainty, now matched Hollard's field reports exactly. His hand-drawn maps had become a guidebook for Allied bombers. In late 1943, Air Chief Marshal Sir Charles Portal authorized strikes on over 80 suspected V-1 launch sites, many of which had been identified solely from Hollard's intelligence. For every successful bombing, Hollard's name circulated quietly in the secret offices of Whitehall. MI6 officers noted that his data proved decisive, but to the man himself, it was not about praise. He never saw the results. He never knew which of his coordinates had been bombed or whether his reports had saved lives. He only knew that the work had to continue. The risk, however, was growing unbearable. German counterintelligence had begun to track irregular movements near the Swiss border. They noticed that certain merchants seemed to vanish for days at a time. Intercepted letters hinted at a leak in the northern departments. Somewhere, someone had whispered the word agir. Hollard responded the only way he knew, by becoming quieter still. He reduced his meetings, changed routes, and destroyed every traceable document. Even his closest couriers never knew the full picture. Despite the tightening noose, he kept operating. His determination bordered on the impossible. During one crossing in early 1944, he carried not just notes but complete diagrams of 20 V-1 launch ramps drawn to scale. It was his most daring run yet. If caught, the Germans would execute him as a spy within hours. But the information reached London, and it changed everything. MI6 analysts in London studied Hollard's data and realized the ramps were not isolated sites but part of a coordinated network. The Germans were planning to launch thousands of V-1s simultaneously, a storm of flying bombs that would devastate London and the southern coast just as the Allies were preparing their invasion. The British response was swift. The RAF and U.S. 8th Air Force launched Operation Crossbow, a massive bombing campaign targeting every known launch site. Each wave of bombers carried maps annotated with Hollard's hand-drawn coordinates. Within weeks, over half of the known V-1 ramps were reduced to rubble. Behind every bombing photo, behind every smoking crater, was the invisible work of a man who still appeared on paper to be a simple lumber trader in occupied France. Yet even as Allied aircraft roared overhead, Hollard moved quietly through the forests, collecting new intelligence. The Gestapo was closer than ever now, but he refused to stop. He told his couriers, If we fall silent, they will launch. And for him, silence was the one thing the enemy could never afford. The strength of a spy is not only in what he knows, it's in what he can endure. By early 1944, Michel Hollard's courage had become both his weapon and his burden. The success of his reports had made him indispensable, but also visible. German intelligence began to sense that something, or someone, was feeding London precise data. Every bomb that struck a launch ramp increased their desperation to find the leak. They didn't know the name Hollard, but they knew there was a man, a phantom, crossing the border with the enemy's secrets. Inside occupied France, the air grew thick with suspicion. The Gestapo began questioning entire villages near Dieppe and Rouen, demanding names of anyone who traveled too much. The resistance responded by turning inward. Trust became a rare currency. One wrong word could mean death. Hollard, though respected, was not immune to doubt. He moved from safe house to safe house, often sleeping in barns or underground cellars. Sometimes his hosts didn't even know who he was, only that he carried messages for France. He'd sit silently beside them, hands wrapped around a cup of weak coffee, staring at the candlelight as if listening for engines outside. Those who met him recalled the same thing: a calm voice, a tired smile, and a sense that he carried the weight of 1,000 invisible lives. The Gestapo's net was tightening. In February 1944, 2 of Hollard's most trusted couriers were caught near Amiens. Under interrogation, one of them broke. The Germans learned about the wood merchant, the man who seemed to move with uncanny freedom through checkpoints. They didn't yet know his name, but they had begun the hunt. Hollard received word of the arrests and made a chilling decision. He destroyed the last written records of Aguirre. Every address, every name, every coded book gone. He erased his own network to protect it. From that moment on, he would operate almost entirely alone. It was a lonely existence. The man who once led dozens of patriots now rode his bicycle through enemy roads as a solitary figure. His disguise remained impeccable, a modest tradesman, polite, unassuming, but behind the civility lay a mind calculating distances, routes, and escape options every second. He no longer whistled when he rode. He avoided eye contact with sentries. He even trained himself to breathe evenly when questioned. Gestapo officers, he knew, could sense fear by the rhythm of the chest. One small mistake, one extra glance, and the war would end for him. But for all his caution, Hollard was not invincible. On February 5, 1944, near the village of Bonneville-Apteaux, a railway worker loyal to the Germans recognized him. Hollard had helped organize resistance in that same region months before. The man informed the Gestapo that a suspicious merchant was meeting strangers near the forest edge. The next morning, as Hollard prepared to cross toward Switzerland again, plainclothes officers appeared on the road. They asked to see his travel papers. His forged documents looked perfect, but one of the men noticed a faint smudge where an official stamp should have been crisp. That was all it took. Within minutes, Hollard was surrounded. They searched his bicycle, his coat, his shoes. When they found the concealed sketches, faint pencil diagrams of rail lines, they knew. He was arrested on the spot and taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Amiens. For days they interrogated him. They demanded names, codes, and safe houses. Hollard refused to speak. Not a single name escaped his lips. The Gestapo tried everything: deprivation, beatings, humiliation. Still he remained silent. One officer reportedly said, "This one would rather die than betray a friend." They eventually sent him to the Fresnes prison, then deported him to Neuengamme concentration camp in Germany. His journey there was a descent into darkness. The man who had once cycled across France now traveled in a cattle car, surrounded by prisoners whose eyes no longer reflected hope. Many didn't know why they'd been arrested. Hollard did. He whispered to a fellow captive, "I did my work. That's enough." Meanwhile, in London, MI6 received the devastating news. Their most reliable agent had vanished. But his final reports, and delivered just weeks before his capture, contained the exact coordinates of the last major V-1 launch bases in northern France. Those coordinates guided Allied bombers through the spring of 1944. When D-Day arrived on June 6th, the skies over Normandy were clear of V-1 launches. The Germans had been robbed of their vengeance weapon. Hollard's silence under torture ensured that Aguirre's remaining members continued feeding intelligence right up to the invasion. He never saw the beaches of Normandy. He never saw the Allies break through. But his work, his quiet defiance, had given them that chance. And even inside the barbed wire hell of Neuengamme, the farmer refused to be broken. Prisoners remembered him as calm, almost serene, even as others despaired. He would look toward the east every morning, one survivor said, as if waiting for something. In April 1945, the camp was liberated. Hollard had survived, barely alive, skeletal but unbroken. He returned to France not as a hero but as a man who had simply finished his duty. When asked about his courage, he said only, "I did what I could with what I had." By the spring of 1944, the war's tempo had become unbearable. The Allies were poised to strike. The invasion of Europe was no longer a question of if, but when. Yet a shadow loomed over their plans. British and American intelligence had intercepted reports of a new German miracle weapon, a pilotless flying bomb being prepared somewhere in northern France. They called it Vergeltungswaffe 1, the Vengeance Weapon 1. Each missile could carry a ton of explosives and reach London in under 20 minutes. Launched in waves, they could devastate entire cities. If the Germans succeeded in deploying them before D-Day, the invasion might collapse before it even began. That's when the British realized one man, already missing in action, had mapped those launch sites before anyone else. Michel Hollard's final reports had pinpointed dozens of V-1 installations stretching from Dieppe to the Pas de Calais. His notes, hand-drawn and smuggled across enemy lines months earlier, were now the foundation of Operation Crossbow. The operation's goal was brutal in its simplicity: destroy the launch ramps before the Germans could fire a single missile. In London's war rooms, planners pored over aerial photographs, matching them with Hollard's sketches. Each pencil line from his notebook became a red target marker on RAF maps. He had drawn them with eerie precision. Even the angle of the concrete ramps and the direction they faced were correct within degrees. On December 5, 1943, long before his arrest, Hollard had delivered one last critical observation. These sites are not for aircraft. The rails are too short. The orientation is constant. Westward, always westward. It was that single sentence that convinced the British War Office that Germany was preparing for long-range bombardment. Now, as Allied air fleets assembled across southern England, Hollard's data dictated their first wave of strikes. On December 20th, the RAF's Mosquito and Typhoon squadrons thundered over northern France. Their target, the strange, half-finished sheds that Hollard had described months earlier. The pilots reported secondary explosions, a clear sign of hidden fuel stores and warheads. The British scientists confirmed it. They had just bombed the first active V-1 launch site. From that moment, Operation Crossbow escalated into one of the most intense bombing campaigns of the war. Through early 1944, Allied bombers struck over 100 suspected V-weapon bases, guided by intelligence rooted in Hollard's fieldwork. Each site delayed Germany's vengeance plan by weeks. Each delay bought time for Eisenhower's armies gathering in secret across the Channel. In February, as Hollard sat in a Gestapo cell unaware of his own legacy, the British Air Ministry issued a quiet note. Intelligence from the Farmer Network has prevented mass deployment of the V-1, but success came at a cost. The Germans responded by dispersing their launch sites deeper into forests, hiding them under camouflage nets or building decoys to confuse reconnaissance. The Allies needed more precision, and even though Hollard could no longer report, his earlier instructions to his couriers, remember patterns, not places, paid off. Members of Aguirre, still operating in secrecy, recalled where materials were shipped, which towns had new roadworks, and which factories suddenly stopped normal production. Piece by piece, they reconstructed the next wave of V-1 sites, and MI6 matched those patterns to aerial evidence. Once again, Hollard's method had saved lives even without his presence. By March 1944, the RAF had destroyed nearly 70% of the V-1 installations under construction. It wasn't total victory, but it was enough to cripple the German timeline. When the first V-1s finally launched in June 1944, they were too late. The beaches of Normandy were already in Allied hands. The invasion had succeeded because the V-1 terror had been delayed. Delayed just long enough for Eisenhower's armies to land, expand, and secure a foothold in France. Historians would later calculate that if the Germans had managed to launch their V-1 barrage in May, when the weapons were first ready, the bombardment could have paralyzed London's command infrastructure and forced the postponement of D-Day by months. Hollard's work, carried out alone and under constant threat, had prevented that scenario entirely. In one debriefing after the war, a British intelligence officer remarked, "Without his reports, the V-1 might have reached readiness weeks earlier. D-Day might have met a storm of fire before the first boat landed." Even inside Germany, confusion reigned. Engineers at Peenemünde, the V-1's development center, complained that Allied bombers seemed to know exactly where their prototypes were stored. "It's as if they had our blueprints," one wrote in frustration. They never knew that those blueprints had been carried across occupied France by a man with forged lumber papers and a bicycle chain oiled with candle wax. The campaign's impact rippled across Europe. While the Allied bombers continued their strikes, reports of sabotage poured in. Trains derailed, fuel depots exploded, shipments went missing. Many of these acts traced back to small cells inspired by Hollard's Aguirre network. He had not only gathered intelligence, he had inspired a method, decentralized, self-reliant, impossible to destroy. But even victory carried its own kind of weight. Every bombing success was built upon human sacrifice. Couriers arrested, villages burned, families interrogated. The war was won through courage but paid for in silence. And as the Allies prepared for the greatest invasion in modern history, they did so on a foundation laid by a farmer who could no longer see the results of his own work. He had given them time, the most precious commodity of war. Time to gather strength, time to build hope, time to cross the sea. The invasion was coming. The world was holding its breath. June 1944. Across the English Channel, the largest invasion force in human history waited for a single word. Go General Eisenhower paced in silence at Southwick House. Cigarette in hand, eyes fixed on the weather reports. The beaches of Normandy had been chosen. The soldiers briefed, the ships loaded. Everything depended on timing, and on what the Germans could or could not do in return. At the top of the Allied High Command's briefing sheets lay one critical assessment: enemy V-weapon capability delayed. Launch readiness incomplete in northern France. Risk of pre-invasion strike minimal. Those words had been made possible by Michel Hollard. In the weeks leading up to D-Day, British intelligence had carefully cross-checked Hollard's pre-capture reports against new aerial photographs. The coordinates he'd smuggled across the border months earlier were still accurate. The same forest clearings, the same angled launch ramps, all under repair from Allied bombing. It was proof that the Germans were behind schedule, proof that the V-1 threat, Hitler's promised revenge, would not arrive in time to stop the invasion. Inside the RAF's No. 83 Group headquarters, pilots studied maps annotated with Hollard's original sketches. Many never knew who had drawn them, only that they were codenamed farmer notes. These diagrams dictated bombing runs up to the very eve of D-Day. On June 5th, the night before the invasion, RAF Mosquitoes made one final sweep across the Pas-de-Calais, targeting the remnants of several V-1 launch sites. Each site struck meant fewer bombs that could be turned against London or the beaches. Hollard's maps, carried through enemy lines on a bicycle, were now fueling precision air raids by hundreds of aircraft. At dawn, June 6th, the invasion began. 5,000 ships crossed the Channel, escorted by thousands of planes. From Utah to Sword Beach, the Allied landings unfolded under skies that should have been filled with German retaliation. But the V-1s did not come. They were still being built, still being tested, still buried under the rubble of bombed concrete. Hollard's intelligence and the RAF's relentless crossbow raids had pushed the German timeline just enough. Eisenhower's planners would later write that the absence of V-weapon strikes during Overlord operations was a decisive factor in maintaining morale and logistics. Without Hollard's intelligence, London and the South Coast could have been engulfed in chaos just as the first troops landed. In the days that followed, the success of D-Day became unstoppable. Once the beachheads were secure, the Allied armies poured into France. The German defenses crumbled under pressure, and within weeks, the Western Front began to collapse. And then, almost too late, the first V-1s finally launched. On June 13, 1944, a full week after D-Day, the first of Hitler's revenge bombs crossed the Channel. It struck near London, killing 6 people. By then, the invasion was already in full momentum. The Germans had missed their chance. Historians would later agree that if the V-1 campaign had begun even 10 days earlier, the psychological and logistical blow could have crippled the Allied invasion's coordination. London might have been forced to divert manpower and aircraft from the front to defend its skies. Supply ports and rail networks could have been delayed or destroyed, but Hollard's intelligence, gathered with a bicycle and a notebook, had neutralized that threat months before. In a debriefing years later, Air Chief Marshal Roderick Hill, head of Britain's anti-aircraft command, said quietly, "Every day of delay in the V-1 offensive was bought with the courage of men like Hollard. Without that delay, Overlord's success might have been paid for in ruin." The Allies knew it too. When French intelligence officers were finally able to confirm that Hollard had survived the camps, they sent word to London. The message was short: "Farmer alive." His reports vindicated. France remembers. In July 1944, the Allies advanced past many of the same regions Hollard had once traversed in secret. Soldiers marched past destroyed ramps, charred forests, and empty guard posts, the ghost of the V-1 program he had helped cripple. British engineers inspected one site near Ivrench and found that its coordinates matched precisely to Hollard's sketches. One officer reportedly murmured, "He saw this place before we ever did." While the world celebrated liberation, few knew that the farmer who had mapped these death machines sat in a hospital bed, recovering from starvation and infection. He weighed less than 100 pounds, his hands trembling from malnutrition. Yet when told that his intelligence had saved lives on D-Day, he smiled faintly and said, "Then it was worth it." In September 1944, MI6 formally credited Michel Hollard as the single most important human intelligence source on the V-1 program. His findings were entered into the official crossbow archives, a quiet acknowledgement for a man who never sought recognition. The British recommended him for the George Cross, one of the highest awards for civilian bravery. France awarded him the Légion d'honneur and the Croix de Guerre. But he remained a humble figure. When journalists asked about his courage, he replied, "I was not brave. I was careful. That is all." He returned to civilian life in post-war France, resuming his work as an engineer. Yet in his garden he kept an old rusted bicycle, the same one that had carried his reports through occupied territory. To him it was not a relic of war, but a reminder of persistence. The war had turned ordinary tools, a pen, a map, a chain of trust, into weapons mightier than bombs. And through them one farmer had deceived an empire. His legacy lived not in medals or ceremonies, but in every soldier who survived D-Day because the skies stayed clear, and in every city that never burned from a V-1 blast. The invasion of Normandy had been won by armies, yes, but it had been saved by a man who fought alone. And as the tide of war turned and Europe began to breathe again, history quietly recorded his victory not on a battlefield, but on a country road, with nothing but courage and a bicycle. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Europe was a continent of ruins. Cities lay in ashes, nations were hollowed out by loss, and heroes emerged quietly from the shadows, many of them unrecognized, many of them unrecorded. Among those ghosts of victory was a man whose war had been fought not with bullets but with silence. Michel Hollard returned to France that summer, carried home by the same roads he had once traveled as a spy. He was frail, barely able to walk without help, yet his mind remained sharp, his memory clear. He had survived Neuengamme, one of the most brutal concentration camps in Germany. Thousands had perished there from starvation, disease, and forced labor. Hollard was among the few who came back. Doctors in Paris described him as a body that refused to die. When asked how he endured, he answered simply, because the work was not finished, he had lost comrades, friends, and nearly every courier from his Ager network. Of the 70 men and women who had served under him, more than half were executed or died in camps. For months after his return, Hollard traveled across France to visit the families of those who hadn't survived. He told them what their sons and daughters had done, not in dramatic words, but in the quiet, factual way that defined him. Each story was an act of remembrance. Each visit, a piece of unfinished duty. Meanwhile, in London, British intelligence was piecing together the vast mosaic of human efforts that had supported D-Day. From resistance cells to codebreakers, from agents in Poland to couriers in Norway. But when the files on the V1 program were declassified, one name stood above all others: Michel Hollard. The MI6 report, later published in part, read, "The Farmer Network's intelligence prevented the premature deployment of Germany's V1 offensive, thus ensuring the operational integrity of Overlord. Without this contribution, the outcome of June 1944 might have differed considerably. For this, the British government awarded Hollard the George Cross in 1946, the highest honor for civilian bravery, second only to the Victoria Cross. The citation read, "For conspicuous courage in the face of mortal danger, and for acts of intelligence service which contributed directly to the liberation of Europe." He received the medal in a modest ceremony at the British Embassy in Paris. Standing among diplomats and officers, the thin, pale man looked uncomfortable in his suit. When the ambassador pinned the medal to his lapel, Hollard simply nodded and whispered, "For them," referring to his fallen comrades. France, too, recognized him. General Charles de Gaulle personally awarded him the Légion d'honneur, calling him the embodiment of French perseverance. The citation added, "When France was silent, he spoke for her with his courage." But even in honor, Hollard remained distant from glory. He rarely attended public events, refused interviews, and avoided discussions about espionage. For him, the war was not a tale of heroism, it was a ledger of sacrifice. In one rare post-war conversation, he told a young journalist, "Do not call us heroes. We did what had to be done. Heroism is when you do it even after you lose hope. I never lost mine." His humility only deepened the mystery around him. Intelligence historians later studied his methods and found them astonishingly modern. Without formal training, Hollard had created an espionage system based on information redundancy, operational secrecy, and moral discipline, principles still used in intelligence networks decades later. He had anticipated counterintelligence by limiting what each agent knew. He had invented memory-based couriering before it became standard practice in Cold War tradecraft. And he had proven that intelligence gathering could be both decentralized and highly accurate, a balance even professional agencies struggled to maintain. In the years that followed, his reports were used as case studies inside MI6 and the CIA. They were cited not just for their accuracy but for their humanity. One analyst wrote, "Hollard demonstrated that courage is a logistical asset. Morality itself became part of his security. But outside those secret archives, his name faded from public view. The post-war world was eager to move forward, to rebuild, to forget. The French resistance was full of legends, and the man with the bicycle seemed too modest to fit the myth. Yet traces of his legacy lingered everywhere. Along the Normandy coast, Allied engineers inspecting bombed launch sites still carried copies of his original sketches. His routes through the French countryside became quiet symbols of defiance. In the small town of Jouy-en-Josas, a plaque appeared on a wall. Here lived Michel Hollard, who crossed the border 49 times to bring freedom closer. He never spoke of those journeys again. He preferred his garden, his tools, and his family. But even in peace, the habits of war remained. He checked his watch precisely. He memorized directions before leaving home. He avoided public transport when strangers seemed too curious. For a man who had spent years pretending to be ordinary, normal life was the hardest disguise of all. Yet he carried no bitterness. When asked in his later years what he felt about Germany, he replied, "I do not hate. I only wish they had loved their country the way I loved mine. Not with words, but with acts." By the early 1950s, he lived quietly outside Paris, occasionally consulting for post-war reconstruction committees. His experience as an engineer once again defined him, building, not destroying. But every June he would stop his work for one day and listen to the news reports commemorating D-Day. He never attended the ceremonies, never gave a speech. He simply stood in silence, eyes closed, as the broadcasters described the beaches he had helped to protect from afar. To him, The sound of the waves on those shores was enough. The war had ended, but Michel Hollard's quiet battle with memory never did. He lived simply, a small house, a garden, a bicycle he refused to throw away. The bicycle's metal frame was bent from years of secret journeys, yet he kept it polished, the chain still oiled. Visitors who asked about it would see him smile faintly and say, "That machine once carried a war on its back." He never exaggerated, never romanticized what he had done. For Hollard, the bicycle was not a symbol of heroism, but of stubborn persistence, the same persistence that had once carried him across occupied France 49 times without being caught. In the 1950s and 1960s, as Europe rebuilt and new wars broke out elsewhere, his name slipped into the margins of history. Resistance leaders were celebrated, generals wrote memoirs, and nations redefined their victories. But the man who had quietly delayed Hitler's secret weapon lived away from the noise of remembrance. When intelligence officers from the new generation visited him for advice, they found no mystique, no cloak and dagger secrets, or only discipline and humanity. He told them, "Spying is not trickery. It is patience and truth. You must never lie to yourself." That phrase became known in British circles as the Hollard Rule. It was taught in intelligence training manuals long after his death. The idea that honesty with oneself was the foundation of deception against the enemy. His wartime reports continued to shape intelligence doctrine. MI6 and later NATO analysts used his work as a model for low-signature espionage, networks that operated invisibly through civilian movements rather than armed resistance. Hollard had proven that the most effective intelligence often came not from soldiers, but from ordinary people who understood their terrain better than any satellite ever could. In 1964, on the 20th anniversary of Dday, a British delegation invited him to London for a private ceremony at the Imperial War Museum. A new exhibit, The Secret War, included a small glass case labeled Personal Belongings of Michel Hollard, the farmer who exposed the V1 program. Inside the case were 3 items: a small notebook, a worn pencil, and a map of northern France, folded 100 times. Beneath them, a single line read, "This man changed the course of the invasion." Hollard stood before the display for a long time. When the curator asked if he wanted to add a statement, he declined. "The map speaks well enough," he said. In France, however, recognition came more slowly. The post-war years had divided the country between those who fought, those who collaborated, and those who simply survived. The resistance had many faces, and stories like Hollard's, quiet, methodical, apolitical, did not fit easily into the narratives of defiance that dominated public memory. Still, among intelligence officers, his legend never faded. The French Deuxième Bureau, military intelligence, studied his methods well into the 1970s. His emphasis on self-reliant agents, minimal communication, and behavioral disguise became textbook material. One instructor reportedly told his trainees, "If you want to learn what real courage looks like, study Hollard, the man who cycled through the Gestapo's front yard." In his final years, Hollard rarely spoke of the war unless asked directly. He gardened, read engineering journals, and volunteered for local charities. But every now and then, an old resistance comrade would visit, and they would sit together in silence, sharing coffee and a long, wordless understanding. He never boasted, but those who knew him saw the quiet pride in his eyes when D-Day was mentioned. He would simply nod and say, "It worked." Michel Hollard passed away in 1993 at the age of 92. His death was peaceful, in his home, surrounded by family. The world had largely forgotten the name, but those who remembered understood that one man's vigilance had altered history's path. It wasn't until the early 2000s that his story began to re-emerge. Historians revisiting the intelligence archives of Operation Crossbow stumbled upon repeated references to Agent Farmer. When they connected the code name to Hollard, they found hundreds of reports written in careful handwriting, concise, analytical, flawless in detail. One British historian, Michael Foote, wrote in his analysis of Allied intelligence operations, "Hollard's network was the single most valuable human intelligence source against the V1. His work delayed Hitler's vengeance and secured the skies over Normandy." In 2017, the French government officially declared Michel Hollard a national hero of the resistance. His name was inscribed at the Mémorial de la France Combattante in Mont Valérien, the highest national monument to those who fought for France's freedom. At the ceremony, a French officer read a simple tribute. He fought not with bullets but with courage. He won not with weapons but with will. He crossed the border not to escape, but to save others. Among the attendees were members of his family and representatives from MI6. The British ambassador placed a wreath that read, "From the grateful people of Britain, for the man who made D-Day possible." Today, few passers-by noticed the small plaque outside his former home. It bears no grandeur, no portrait, only a few engraved words. Here lived Michel Hollard, who risked everything so that others might see freedom. No statues, no streets named after him. Just quiet remembrance, the kind he would have wanted, because Hollard's story was never about recognition. It was about duty, the kind that doesn't end when the mission is done, the kind that builds nations, saves lives, and disappears without applause. In the end, Michel Hollard's life reminds us that the most extraordinary acts often come from the most ordinary people. A single farmer, armed with nothing but resolve, can tilt the balance of history. And though his footsteps have faded, the path he cleared, and through danger, through silence, through fear, remains one of the purest examples of human courage the war ever produced. History often remembers the loudest moments, the clash of armies, the speeches, the flags. But the truth of war lives in its quiet corners, in the unmarked roads, the secret signals, and the hands of people the world never sees. Michel Hollard belonged to that invisible world. He was not a soldier, not a spy in the conventional sense. He was a man who simply refused to look away when evil took root. His war was not waged with rifles or rhetoric, but with the weight of conscience and the endurance of one man's legs on a cold bicycle road. He rode through occupied lands without fanfare or glory, carrying fragments of truth that would one day save thousands. Each journey could have been his last. Yet in every mile, Hollard showed that resistance was not just an act of defiance, it was an act of faith. Faith that humanity, even in its darkest hours, could still choose courage over compliance. The maps he drew changed the course of the invasion. The intelligence he gathered crippled Hitler's dream of vengeance. But beyond strategy and victory, Hollard's legacy lies in something deeper. The idea that history is built not only by generals, but by those who act when no one is watching. When the world stood divided between conqueror and conquered, he proved that one man's conviction could redraw the line. He never asked to be remembered. Yet in the quiet rhythm of his story lies the pulse of every nameless soul who fought tyranny with nothing but willpower. And as time moves further from the war that defined a generation, his journey reminds us why freedom has a cost, not in medals or monuments, but in the courage to act when silence is safer. Michel Hollard didn't set out to save the world. He set out to do what was right. And in doing so, he did save it, one secret road at a time.